Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 175, July 22nd to July 28th, 1864. Last week, we wrapped up operations in West Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley, leading into Sheridan's campaigns against Early, which are going to kick off in September. In talking about some of these actions, we mentioned the burning of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which combined with the continued operations of Jubal Early would convince Grant to leave the 6th Corps as well as additional reinforcements that could have been sent to Petersburg in the area of Northern Virginia. We also talked about action in Mississippi with Forrest being bested by A.J. Smith at the Battle of Tupelo. This week, we are going to return to Georgia and check in on what's been going on in the Atlanta campaign. Before we do that, though, let's talk a little bit about some Patreon content. And of course, we did a movie review for this month, and that would have been Cold Mountain. And that pairs very well, actually, with next week's episode. We're going to talk about the Battle of the Crater. And in that movie, it's a 2003 movie with Jude Law and Nicole Kidman. And that movie does depict the Battle of the Crater in the early part of the film, so it's a good pairing to go with next week's episode. Talked a little bit about the historical accuracy, not only of the Battle of the Crater, but also Confederate Home Guard units. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. And those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. When we last left off, Sherman had arrived at the Chattahoochee River, his forces being able to see Atlanta. Joseph Johnston had originally constructed a line on the north side of the river, but with the large forces arrayed against him, he would, under the cover of darkness, spreading straw on the pontoons to muffle the sound, pull back across the river. Johnston had arrived to the conclusion that he could not protect all of the crossings of the Chattahoochee. This would be bad for Johnston's tenure as Army commander, Jefferson Davis deciding to replace the officer. Now, this was already after they had a rocky relationship, and after they had asked for Johnston to give an outline of his plans for the continued defense of Atlanta. Remember, he had declined to do that outside of Richmond, and in 1864 it was no different. Now, the argument is that some believe if Johnston had been allowed to continue to operate, the Atlanta campaign would have been very different in terms of outcome. For someone who was prepared to most likely give up Richmond in 1862, I'm personally not so sure. However, there is something to be said for extending Sherman's line of supply. What might have helped in this strategy was someone like Forrest operating in the Federal rear, but as we have highlighted, this was not to be. I believe in the early stages, Johnston does a good job of keeping the army together. While the casualties will remain low, there needed to be a certain amount of acceptable risk in his actions, and as far as I can see, there was very little. There was the incident at Cassville where the tables might have been turned, but little else other than the continued retreat and defensive lines. Now, it should be said also is that I think Johnston knows there's no help coming, so maybe he's very conservative in that regard, which is fair. Could someone like Bragg have done better? I don't think so. While Johnston is not done with our story, he is going to be sidelined yet again. We can really compare, as we mentioned, the 1862 action with Joseph Johnston, the Peninsula Campaign right before the 7 Days. It's when Robert E. Lee takes over, and we can compare that to the Atlanta campaign, and there are some similarities, and yet there are differences, right? The main difference is that Joseph Johnston is wounded at Seven Pines, and he most likely would have retained control of the army, although the relationships were starting to be strained between him and the Confederate president. So it is not necessarily a foregone conclusion he would have remained in that role. However, his wounding does open the door for Robert E. Lee, the premier battlefield commander for the Confederacy. It is similar in the sense where you have Jefferson Davis, who is often criticized for being a little meddlesome in his running of the Confederate war effort, right? It's not quite like Lincoln. There's a contrast there where Lincoln is kind of hands-off, especially when he gets the right guy in place with the Ulysses S. Grant. He says, all right, run the war effort. But Jefferson Davis is a little bit more hands-on, and he does get criticized for micromanaging just a bit. But at the same time, it is fair. In 1862, he kind of goes to Joseph Johnston and says, hey, what are your plans defending Richmond? And when Joseph Johnston essentially doesn't really give him an answer, it's like, well, you are going to defend Richmond, right? And it's the same case here in Atlanta where it's like, hey, where is the plan to actually save Atlanta? And as we've pointed out, I think, in a previous episode, as we will point out in future episodes, Atlanta itself is not necessarily the most strategic relevant position. It does have a lot of manufacturing capability. It is a pretty big city, but especially as the Union Army approaches, a lot of that capability is removed. So it's not necessarily as important anymore. It is symbolic as the Confederate capital was back in 1862. So Jefferson Davis, we can kind of feel for him where he's like, hey, you are going to defend Atlanta, right? Like, that's part of the plan here. And Joseph Johnston is just not going to give him the yes or no on that. And ultimately, it does lead to his removal. So now we have a tough decision for Jefferson Davis. Remember how we talked about how pickings were sometimes slim when it comes to Army command. Leonidas Polk is dead, so that takes him off the table. However, Polk had at least acted independently before, and I think had he survived Pine Mountain, he might have been tabbed for the position. That leaves the next general in line, which would have been Hardee, who was offered command of the army following Bragg's removal and had declined it, and so it would not be offered to him again. That leaves the only other corps commander in the army, John Bell Hood. Now, Hood is an interesting choice because he had only recently been elevated to corps command, and he really had not performed all too well in that capacity. Lee would be asked if Hood was a good choice for army command, and he would essentially respond no, which tells you a lot. Lee very rarely is going to be very blunt, right? He is the Southern gentleman. However, his statement is pretty straightforward. You can understand what he's saying. Like, hey, this guy is not going to be good in this role. I don't recommend it. Hood was a good division commander, and some might say maybe he could have been a decent corps commander given more time. But Army command was going to be tough for him. Hood had lobbied, though, while recovering from his wounds in Richmond, and so he would be given the job. The thought process was that Hood was a good attacking general. This was going to be in contrast to the defensive-minded Johnston for sure. The question can be asked, though, is this the right move? Is it the wrong decision to replace Johnston? Maybe not. Is Hood the correct decision? Hindsight being what it is, and spoiler alert, a lot of sources will point to no. However, look at who else is going to be slated. There are those that have said that William J. Hardee would have been the best choice to lead the army. However, remember that there are all these weird rules and honor associated with some of these things. The fact that he had been offered and declined, and then for a brief time actually removed from the army, right, leads you to think he's not going to be given the second chance. And that's really where the list ends, right? There's not really a whole lot of other generals on the table, at least at that point, that would seem to be fitting to the role, right? We have A.P. Stewart, who will eventually get tabbed in the latter stages of the war for Army command, really when everything is essentially over. But he's really untested. He's just as untested as, say, a John Bell Hood. You have anyone currently on the bench, so a list of names that would underwhelm you or could try to pull somebody from Lee or even get the disgruntled Taylor away from the Trans-Mississippi, but all that's going to take time. Given that there are boots on the ground, despite only there being a shorter period of time, that's going to lead to at least a logical decision of getting Hood into Army command. A key point to make, though, is that morale is going to remain low. Usually when an unpopular commander is removed, then there is a little boost. And you can see this in the sporting world as well, with a losing coach being fired, and then another coach taking on, the interim coach taking on, and then maybe the football team, shall we say, will win their next game. But you don't really see that here, right? It is more that the rank and file will side with Johnston, who is much like McClellan in the way that he's not going to waste lives, he's not going to attack, while a lot of them are going to write, well, now that Hood is in charge, we really know what's in store with us, and we're going to see that they are proved correct. The former commander of the Texas Brigade would waste no time in wanting to show the Confederate president that he chose the correct replacement. Hood, though, was new to Army command, and so he was unaware of the dispositions of his troops. The new commanding general would write that he had reached out to Johnston, and Johnston had agreed to stay and help him in that regard, although Johnston goes to Atlanta and then leaves, a point of contention between the two men after the war. The situation was this, though. The rebels had given up their line across the Chattahoochee, and now Sherman has some options. The rebels have taken a line around Peachtree Creek north of the city. The plan would be to swing out and hit Atlanta from the north and the east, although partially enveloping the city would be on the table. If we think Peachtree to the north, Ezra Church to the west, and the Battle of Atlanta to the east, that's what we will be talking about today. Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland would be occupying the front of the Federal advance, and thus Hood would surmise that this was going to be the main threat. When Hood takes over, he actually tries to let Johnston remain in command of the army temporarily. When a coach starts mid-season, still going with that analogy, then it's pretty difficult to institute a new game plan. Therefore, Hood, by July 19th, is still fairly unaware of where the troops are around him. Thomas, in the meantime, had begun his crossing of Peachtree Creek. In this crossing, though, there would be problems, and it would not entirely be without incident. Confederates in places would skirmish with the Federals attempting to gain the other side, and gaps would start to form in the line. John Newton originally would advance without support. The 52nd Ohio would suffer heavy casualties, gaining a ridge, and then being attacked by Arkansas troops under Walthall. Joe Hooker would be quite lackadaisical in his advance. He would initially not link up with Newton, and by the time he gained the far side, he would not be super vigilant in setting up defensively. Hood would call for a conference with his corps commanders. Frank Cheatham would be in temporary corps command, along with A.P. Stewart and Hardee. In this meeting, Hood would reveal his intention to hit the Union troops immediately. On paper, this would seem to be the correct course of action. Thomas had moved part of his command across the creek, the other part was on the other side. So tactically, it would seem like the right call. However, time would be of the essence. Hood needed to launch this attack before the Union Army had time to really dig in. July 20th would mark the strike. The Union troops, it should be said, had been warned by Sherman, alluring the masses that it was now Hood's show, and to expect some kind of aggressive action. This kind of goes to show that these guys know each other, right, from, say, West Point days or from previous battlefield experience. So Sherman, it's kind of funny, has a pretty good idea of what Hood is going to do. With Thomas moving his men across Peachtree Creek, this would give Hood the ability to be aggressive. His plan was to hit the Federals, but to do so in a way where he would trap them between the creek and the river. This would prove to be quite complicated, adding into the fact his forces were going to attack in echelon and by the oblique, which was a complicated maneuver. We will know from our time spent with Braxton Bragg at Army Command that this would be hard to pull off fully. Sherman had decided that the movements of Schofield and McPherson would go toward distracting Hood, but given Hood was not entirely sure where they were, this would be an overestimation. In fact, it was the lack of a link-up between Thomas and the supporting armies that inspired the assault. Johnston actually claimed it had been his intention, but it is unclear how valid that is. As the armies moved closer to the city, they would connect back up, so really, if Hood was going to do something, he would have to do it quickly. July 20th would see the attacks jump off. Luckily for the Confederates, Newton had his command relatively isolated and facing Hardee's entire corps. The bad news was that Hardee would attack essentially without any kind of conviction. Bates' division would flank the Union line and possibly be in a spot to hit around into the rear, but they would be lost in the trees and the brush. Manny and Walker's division would therefore be attacking Newton, with Claiborne in reserve. Inexplicably, Claiborne's command, maybe the best combat troops in the army, would be held in reserve for this battle. Walker and Manny would see some success in capturing Newton's skirmish line, but the success would there end. Clement Stevens would be struck in the head, a wound that would prove mortal during this attack. Brigades of Gist and Mercer would push toward a key bridge over the creek, capturing of which would cut off the Yankees. However, Emerson Updike would be assigned to form several regiments to hit these attackers in the flank, and 20 pieces of artillery would be formed to shred the threat, stopping any kind of success Hardee might have seen. His corps outnumbered Newton nearly 5-1, and yet he was unable to capitalize. Stuart's corps would be more vigorous in their attack. Loring's division would hit William Thomas Ward's division of Hooker's corps. Ward would go on to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives, and on this day he would see Mississippi men of Winfield Scott Featherston. The Magnolia Staters would press the skirmish line back, but a key counterattack would occur under Benjamin Harrison, supported by Coburn's brigade. They would attack up a ridge and push the rebels back, capturing several battle flags. In fact, the rebels had been hit with such a heavy fire that they would withdraw back up the ridge, chased by the Federals, eventually reaching their jump-off point. Scott's command would likewise hit Geary's, but because of the staggering in the attack, some of Geary's men would actually be able to assist in the repulse of Featherston, his flank in the air during their assault. Scott's brigade does keep Geary's command very busy and actually throws them into temporary disarray. It is the depth of the Union position and subsequently lack of support that will keep Geary and his command safe. Additionally, O'Neill under Walthall would also press troops under Alpheus Williams. The command of Williams and O'Neill would display some of the fiercest firefighting of the battle, but the Federal troops would hold. French would then throw 2 of his small brigades at the Union troops, but they too would hold. Some of the units of this division not even jumping off, because by that point, the situation was of no use. As the Confederate attack failed, the Union forces would shore up their positions, and then push skirmishers back forward. McPherson would only have Wheeler and the militia against him, but he would not advance very far. Likewise, Schofield had a thin line arrayed against him, but he would make small progress. That evening, though, Union artillery would be able to fire into Atlanta, the first shells to do so. Given the pressure, a withdrawal would be called for by Hood. The battle would cost the rebels 2,500 men, compared to 2,000 on the side of the Federals. July 21st would be different from the 20th, in that McPherson would continue to put the squeeze on Atlanta. Destruction of all the railroads was going to be high on the list for Sherman, but also trying to bombard the city. In fact, the shells that had been fired into Atlanta would cause an exodus among the civilian population. Evacuation aside, Wheeler had a cavalry screen of some 3,000 troopers against McPherson's entire command of over 20,000. Wheeler did have his line anchored on a bold hill, which would soon become the object of the Union advance. Wheeler would continually call for help, and a brigade of Cheatham's command would be sent. Cheatham, of course, is in temporary command. Stephen Dilley is on his way to take over, despite his lackluster performance at Tupelo, but other than that blemish, he had proven himself in a command position. Claiborne would be dispatched to deal with troops under Mortimer Leggett. Eventually, Leggett would be able to charge and take the height at a cost of a few hundred casualties on both sides. Hood would then develop a new plan. Sherman had left an opportunity on the table to capitalize on the flank. Hardee would be marched through the city so that perhaps on the 22nd a flank attack could be launched. Now at the beginning of Hood taking over, he has approximately 50,000 or so men, some 56% of what Sherman has in his army group. The move would be ambitious, but the payoff if it succeeded would be great. There were 2 main problems though in the move. The first was that getting Hardee to march all night was going to tire out his command. In fact, a large portion of his corps would fall out of line due to exhaustion. Some men would take the opportunity to loot houses in Atlanta, as well as many that had been abandoned. The second problem was that Thomas Sweeney's division of Dodge's Corps would be placed in a position to protect an approach from the south. They would dig in and also have artillery in a good supporting position. Sherman had originally wanted to move Dodge to destroy some railroads, and McPherson had convinced him otherwise. On the 22nd, the Confederates would see their attack time run over. Hardee, though still wishing to press the attack, would continue. Bate and Walker would launch uncoordinated assaults at Sweeney, who they were surprised to find in front of them. Walker would be killed instantly after taking a round to the head. These attacks would prove to be ineffectual. McPherson had responded to the action, but was worried to find that there was a gap in his line. Claiborne would launch into this gap, McPherson riding forward to personally observe. He would run into the rebels and turn and attempt to flee, unfortunately being shot in the back and killed. James Birdsey McPherson would be the 10th and final Union Major General killed in combat during the war. Claiborne's Arkansas troops and Smith's Texans would attack with ferocity, capturing a battery before being involved in the struggle for Bald Hill. Leggett would do a good job in defending several attacks from Claiborne. In fact, the action would be very close at points. Otho Strahl would be severely wounded in this action, as would Manning Force, who was shot in the mouth. Cheatham's Corps would then be thrown into the attack. They would see some success before Blackjack Logan rallied his 15 Corps men, throwing the rebels back. Claiborne's last attack would jump off at 6, and see the same result as before. Now we do have an account from the Union perspective that is quite lengthy, but does give us a pretty good idea of the action. Especially mentioned are the attacks under Confederates by Cheatham's divisions under Stevenson, Brown, and Clayton. As usual, at daylight I went down to the skirmish line to learn the condition of things. Soon General Morgan L. Smith sent an order to move forward my line and field the enemy. I pushed forward and soon began driving the enemy skirmish line. At his skirmish pits, I redressed it and advanced on his main works, and soon drove his skirmishers in, but without giving them time to form. I hurried forward with a shout and a volley, which set the rebels skedaddling, and a regiment of reserves in full and rapid retreat. In the main works, I again dressed the line and pursued them, capturing a few prisoners and 2 lines of skirmish pits, and drove them square into their main works, and occupied with my line a portion of the Corporation of Atlanta, not more than 600 yards from their forts. Here they served with us minis, case, and solid shots. I soon discovered where their skirmish pits were and made my line crawl forward in some places within 20 yards of them and build rail barricades. I found one set of his own skirmishers timid and awkward, and had to crawl up to a point where I wished to post, show them the bearings and the range, and help them build it. Their skirmishers were kept so close to the ground that I had only 2 wounded by musket balls. One solid shot knocked down a rail pile and buried the men under it. A captain thought destruction had come and wished to retire, but I made it a point to never give up the ground if my flanks are protected, and so they rebuilt it. I sent back for shovels to dig good pits, but our division general was not at liberty to send them to us. Our men in authority appeared to think the enemy were evacuating Atlanta because they were moving columns to the left. About 9 or 10 a.m., Logan's senior aide came out, and I showed him how earnestly they, the Confederates, were working in town upon their fortifications, and asked if it looked like an evacuation. He said no. I then asked him for tools, but they came not. Our commanders appeared infatuated with the thought of evacuation of Atlanta. After a time, 2 regiments of infantry and a section of artillery were sent off as a second reserve. I laid down and got a good nap, and awoke around 12 or 1. Just after I got up, Lieutenant Adolph Allers of the 47th Ohio and 2 men were wounded near me, and I was struck with dirt, bark, or something, and Allers reported me wounded. Firing soon commenced, and became very heavy on the extreme left and in the rear. Oh, how anxiously I listened and waited, how anxious for the cheers. The enemy cheered before his charges, our men cheered after repulsing them. For 2 hours, they appeared to drive our line back, until it was at almost right angles with mine, the 15th Corps. Can you imagine how my heart throbbed? Every pulsation grew more rapid. There I sat under a big oak tree, only 600 yards from the main line of the enemy works, from which solid shot was being thrown, and caisson shells too, with fearful rapidity, at and over us. I was anxious, not from fear, but dread that we might lose our advantage, the ground we had gained, and again be compelled to retake it by charges. At 3 o'clock, the tide of war seemed rolling back. I could not mistake those cheers, and that firing the enemy at last were checked, and being driven, oh, how rapidly. At 4 p.m., we had regained our old lines, and the fighting on the left had subsided, like a fierce rain and windstorm, and only gusts and sobs sounded in the ear. So if we take a break from the quote here that we have, the account, there's a couple of takeaways to throw out here, and this is something that we've talked about before, in that at this stage in the war, it's all about earthworks, the construction of earthworks, right? So any ground taken, you're going to throw up some earthworks, and there's going to be additional fortifications that he is mentioning the Confederates are building beyond that. And the other mention that I think you kind of get here is that, hey, I don't want to be involved in the frontal assault on earthworks, right? You have that difference in the beginning of the war where it's more Napoleonic. It's not considered manly to be behind earthworks. You have a complete 180, and the tactics have changed now. So that's another important call out. My attention was called from this by a captain saying, "Look, Major, look. What a grand sight." I was almost entranced by it. The enemy's Major General Thomas C. Hyman's division of 25 regiments, commanded by Major General John C. Brown, were moving out of their works and deploying a line of battle. How well they moved, how perfectly, and how grandly did the first line advance with the beautiful battle flags waving in the breeze. Not an unsteady step, nor a waver was perceptible in it. Anon they moved by the right flank, then halted and fronted, and a second line was formed. I saw them complete it, and an officer rode a short distance from us to advance their skirmish line, and I ordered several of the men to shoot him, but they failed. I then saw the 4th Division skirmish line to the left break and run, called my attention, and remained until I saw their line of battle approach within 250 yards of us. By the retreat of the 4th Division skirmishers, my left was exposed, and I marched back to my first reserve. Here I shall tell you that as soon as I saw the 2nd Confederate battle line form and the advance toward us begin, I sent back word. At the reserve we halted, and again opened fire on the enemy, drove in his skirmishers, and then the line flanked us, on the left, and was within about 50 yards. I rallied on the 2nd Reserve. Here we made a fine little fight, and broke their skirmish lines, but being outflanked, we were compelled to fall back. In making this distance part of the time, I moved leisurely, and part lively picked up a canteen of coffee and moved for the Union Works, when some miserable Southern traitor, with murder stamped on his countenance, deliberately shot at me. But I was a little too far away, and his bullet almost spent struck at me a glancing blow in the muscles of my left thigh as I was lifting my leg to run. I knew if I was hurt, it would bleed in my boot, so I went on as rapidly as I could. Other bullets were dropping too close to make it at all pleasant. So it is kind of interesting that he does order his men to try to take out a Southern officer, but when there's a Confederate who tries to take him out, it's a completely different story. He doesn't see anything wrong with ordering his men to fire on a Confederate mounted officer, but one Confederate trying to shoot at him, well, I imagine I would probably react very differently to it as well, but it's just kind of interesting. And you have one sentence, and then essentially the next sentence, or a couple sentences later, you have this kind of different perspective. The rebels reformed and advanced upon our main line in 3 columns. 2 columns moved up on our right, and were both, after a heavy fire, severely repulsed, and took refuge behind some outbuildings and a large house where they have reformed. About 20 yards from our works on the left of the rail and wagon roads is a ravine, at which the railroad was so thick with undergrowth as to completely screen as well as protect an advancing column. The railway through our lines is built in a cut about 15 feet deep. On the left of the railway was a section of artillery occupying 3 rods, about 50 feet. The width of a cut at the top is 3 rods, and between cut and wagon road on right of railroad is a space of 4 rods, 65 feet, protected by a log earthwork terminating a few feet from the railway. The wagon road is almost 2 rods, 33 feet wide, and on the right of this road was a section of artillery occupying 3 rods more, and all of this space of 15 rods, only 1 company in position, and only 1 platoon, 16 men, was between the artillery section and the space, the wagon and rail roads. The cut was open and clear. Nowhere was it occupied by troops nor blockaded. The wagon road was likewise open and unoccupied by works or troops. When Colonel Wells S. Jones, 53rd Ohio, came up for the reserve, he suggested to General Smith and Brigadier General John Lightburn the propriety of burning said outbuildings and placing his regiment in rear of this artillery to support it and shut the gaps. Yet they disdained the proffer and were not filled. Concealed by the dense smoke of artillery, the first we saw of the third enemy column, it was rushing in the gap in the wagon road around the low works between the rail and wagon roads over the parapet at the guns. Everyone was surprised, but none thought of moving. The platoon between the guns fired and fought with bayonets and butts of their muskets. The other platoon lying down in the rear of it could not fire without killing their comrades, and artillerists in their front. Some of the men in the platoon were bleeding at the ears and nose from the concussion, yet fought until all were killed, wounded, and captured, except 4. I started across the road to move the other platoon to make it effective when I happened to look at the upper end of the cut and saw a column of rebels deploying from it. This second Union platoon was shot in my line of fire on every side to avoid capture and retired. Simultaneously, the whole line began to fall back. General Smith moved over the right, and Lightburn went off on a run. I heard no order given, and after vainly trying to rally the men, dashed into the woods, where on a small ridge I halted a few men, and again tried to form a line. Then, hearing someone shouting halt, I went to the road, supposing it was one of our officers trying to form the line. I came within 5 feet of a rebel officer on a white horse with a flag in his hand and a revolver in the other. I took this in at a glance. He said, "Halt. We'll treat you like men." I said, "Hell, stranger, this is no place for me to halt," and went for the bushes. I told a man at my elbow to shoot him. When I got out of his reach, I went slow and got some men of the 47th to go down and run off 2 caissons which the artillery had abandoned. I then went down to the works. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace and Captain Pugh of the 47th Ohio, while striving vainly to form a line, were captured. Only 4 officers of the 47th were left. I was relieved as division picket officer to take command of the regiment and reformed it very quickly, and then ordered forward and marched up the road some distance by the flank. I then was ordered into line to fix bayonets and to retake the works, with 1 small company and some men from the other regiments who joined me. I advanced on the double quick and got within a few feet of the works, when such was the hailstorm of fire and bullets which swept over us that both flagstaffs were shot off. The regiment's standard was torn from the staff by the fragment of a shell, 1 color bearer was killed, and a color corporal wounded. Others, as a matter of course, fell. Finding I was completely flanked, I withdrew. So we had a pretty good account of the action here at the Battle of Atlanta. Battle of Bald Hill, Battle of Atlanta is also called here. We see the confusion in some of the action, how close it was at some point. You know, he runs into a Confederate officer. We mentioned that in some places it was, hand to hand. In this account, it's also mentioned here. So pretty fierce fighting, and really the largest battle in these string of combats that Hood is going to fight. Hood's command would suffer some 5,000 casualties, maybe as many as 5,500. This would be compared to 3,700 casualties for McPherson's command. Sherman would be saddened to learn the death of his friend McPherson, who had been campaigning with him for some time now. Hood would report back to Richmond that a great victory had been won. While it was true that the Confederates had been able to break the Union line in certain places, Bald Hill was still in the hands of the Yankees, and the rebels had suffered many irreplaceable casualties. S.D. Lee had arrived to replace Cheatham, however, and Walker's brigades were divided into the army. For the Union, Sherman would decide to shift the Army of Tennessee from the left to the right. You see, they had done good work in tearing up track toward Decatur, something that was high on the wish list for Sherman. Remember, he had wanted Dodge to accomplish this task before the fight for Bald Hill. Lovell Rousseau had launched a cavalry raid into Alabama that had cut the line from Montgomery, so the limited rail lines would be an issue for Hood. This move from left to right would threaten the line to Macon, their objective being the Lickskillet Road. A general bombardment of the city would begin in the meantime, causing more civilians to vacate. a decision would be needed for Army command in the meanwhile. Sherman decided that he would not elevate Blackjack Logan into this position. Turns out he was not as confident in the non-West Pointer. Instead, he would tab Oliver O. Howard. Now, you could say this is a very puzzling decision considering that Logan has been with the Army for some time. Howard has only recently joined as part of these reinforcements into this Army group, so it is a little bit of a puzzling decision. Howard, despite being one of these generals who is considered perhaps to be saving the Union at Gettysburg, right? He does have the stain of the performance of the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville, and then they also broke on the first day at Gettysburg. So you could also look at it from that regard. If you are a member of the Army of Tennessee, you're like, oh, man, this guy didn't win where he was before, so why is he taking over? He's a stranger to the Army, whereas we know Blackjack Logan. Howard, to his credit, is actually going to realize this, and initially he was going to decline the offer, but eventually be convinced to accept. Sherman's going to realize that Logan is going to take a hit in terms of morale for being passed over for this promotion, and anybody in a professional setting, if you've ever been passed over promotion, you probably can understand kind of wanting to take some time, right? Especially if you are the internal candidate. Taking over the Army of Tennessee en route from moving from one flank to the other, Howard would instruct his men to dig in wherever they could, including Ezra Church. In fact, pews from the church itself were pulled out for the effort of digging in. Sherman was convinced there was no danger in an attack. After all, 2 attempts had already failed. Howard, however, had attended West Point with Hood and was convinced the opposite would happen. Lee was on his way to check the Union advance, so was Stuart, while Hardee and Smith would hold the defenses of Atlanta. Now, to be fair to Hood, his orders for Lee were not to attack the enemy. Protection of the Lick-Skillet Road was going to be the primary objective. Ezra Church is actually shy of the Lick-Skillet Road, so the Confederate troops are going to be able to accomplish that task without having to have an assault. That's important to note. Frank Armstrong's cavalry, as well as some artillery, would begin skirmishing. Lee would arrive on the field during the action on the 28th. He would make the decision to engage the enemy, despite the breastworks on a rise on the other side of a valley. This threat to the extreme right of the line would actually be real. Clayton and Brown would throw their commands in the line piecemeal. While the Federals were originally thrown off their line, Logan's command would hold. Howard would also move artillery into a position where, if there was a flank movement, then it could be covered. There would be no master flanking move like there had been at Chancellorsville. Each of the attacks were thrown back, in some places with very little casualties on the part of the Union regiments. This is not to say that some of the rebels did not gain close to the line. In fact, they were so close in some places that a Confederate officer was pulled behind the breastworks and taken prisoner. Despite the repulse, Randall Gibson's mostly Louisiana command would move forward into a position to attack. Before they were ready, the attack would jump off, with heavy casualties to the brigade. As Brown was getting smacked away, A.P. Stuart would arrive on the field. Now Hood would not be on the field, but Stuart had been given orders to be in a position to flank Howard the next day. Stuart and Lee would have the same rank with the same date of commission, so neither was superior to the other. Lee would call on Stuart to assist, and assist he would by throwing Walthall's division into the fray. Walthall would throw Reynolds, who had been reinforced by replacements, including government workers, as well as O'Neill and Quarles, but all would be repulsed. During this action, Loring would arrive on the field and be struck in the chest, removing him from the combat. Featherston would then replace him. Likewise, Stuart would be hit with a spent ball in the head, and after relinquish command of the corps to Walthall. The attacks on the 28th would sputter out, with nothing really to show for the Confederates. They had sustained 3,000 casualties compared to maybe 642 Federals. Howard, in my mind, despite maybe being a savior at Gettysburg, has been vindicated from his previous stigma. Hood's attacks had been ineffective. The Confederates would refrain from continued assaults. Now, there would be more battles, including some cavalry action, but we'll cover that in a future episode. With that, we're going to go ahead and call it a day. John Bell Hood has taken over for Joseph Johnston, and he has not really sparkled as the new army leader. 3 battles, 3 attacks, and nothing really to show for it other than a loss of life. To be fair, maybe if Johnston had been in the position, things would have been different. Personally, I kind of feel for Hood, who has had to try to turn things around very quickly. The attacking commander Hood is going to remain in his headquarters instead of going out into the field and seeing things for himself. Now, this is what Lee had done in previous battles, but for an aggressive offensive commander, we can point out that him not being on the field is actually going to hamper this ability. Next week, we are going to return to Virginia to catch up on what's been going on in the siege of Petersburg. Most notably, one of the more famous events, the Battle of the Crater. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.